In this video, I'm going to show you how I turn my Christmas tree blocks into a little Christmas quilt. You can make this quilt as big as you like. I'm going to use 9 blocks, 5 with Christmas trees and 4 made from Christmas fabric. But first, let me show you how to make the Christmas tree blocks. To make a Christmas tree block, you need a 4 by 4 inch square of batting or felt. You also need a 4 by 4 inch square of fabric for your background. You need a 2.5 by 3 inch piece of fabric for the tree, and a 3/4 by 3/4 inch square of fabric for the trunk, a button, not too big, and thread. Now I'm using a glittery one, but you can use any thread you like. First, you need to cut the fabric for the tree. And that's what you need to do. So you take this square, cut it like that to give you the shape of the tree. Then you put your square together. The trunk and the tree. And you pin everything. Once you've done that, stitch round the outside, add the button in the center of your square and stitch the circles. If you're not sure how to do this, please have a look at the earlier Going Round in Circles videos. There are lots of ways to join your blocks together. You can do it like this, do the zigzag and join them like that. But today I'm going to do something different. I'm going to applique my squares onto a piece of background fabric. I've already prepared my fabric. I've got it ironed onto a fusible batting that I like to use, and I've drawn lines on the fabric so that I know where to place my squares. So it's going to look something like this. Okay, so now the first thing I need to do is to zigzag around the outsides of my squares. And I'm going to do that with a very thin blendy thread so that you don't really see it, but it makes the squares easier to work with. The size of your background obviously depends on how many blocks you've made and want to use. I'm using 9 blocks, and my piece of fabric is about 16 inches square. The space between the blocks is about ½ an inch. So that's just to give you an idea. Now I've just finished zigzagging around my blocks. Hope you can see that. So now the next step is that I'm going to trim off all the little threads that are sticking out, and then I'm going to pin my blocks to the background and take them over to the sewing machine and stitch round the edges with a straight stitch, again with a very thin thread so that you don't see a lot of that. So I have to pin all my blocks in the right places, and then I can decide, I'm doing it wrong now, see, that's why you need to pin all your blocks, and when you like the layout, then you can go in and stitch all of the blocks to your background. Okay, now as you can see, I've attached all the squares to the background, and I've done that using a very thin thread and a straight stitch around the edges of each square. Now you can decide that this is what you want and that you're going to leave it like this. I haven't added backing yet, so if this is what you want, you add the backing and finish the edge and you've finished your quilt. But you can also decide to do some other things. You can do some stitching around the edges of each of your squares. You can do that by machine using a satin stitch, or by hand using whatever stitch you like to use for that. You can also decide to use some thicker thread and stitch some cording around each of your squares, or you can decide to do something else, and I think that's what I'm going to do. So I've got some ribbon here, and I'm thinking of stitching that like that to just cover the edges of my squares. So that's going to be my next step, stitching the ribbon along the verticals and the horizontals to just cover the edges of my squares. The horizontal ribbons have been stitched on, so now I'm going to do the vertical ones, and I'm also going to add the backing at the same time. So I'm going to stitch the ribbons on and stitch the backing on at the same time. I've finished stitching all the ribbons onto my quilt, as you can see, and you can see the ribbon just covers the edges of all my squares. Now if you want to, you can add more stitching by hand or by machine, but I'm quite happy with it as it is now. Let me show you the back as well, so you can see that I've added the backing while I was stitching the vertical ribbons. So my next step is going to be trimming and then adding a binding and a tunnel, and my little Christmas quilt will be done. I trimmed the little quilt, and then I thought it might be nice to add some more green to the edge, so that hopefully when I add the binding we'll just have a little bit of green coming through between the binding and the quilt, like that. My little Christmas tree quilt is finished. So let me show you some of the details. As you can see, I've added the binding, and there's this little bit of green ribbon just peeping out between the binding and the quilt. I also decided that I wanted to add some more hand stitching along two sides with the gold thread to add some more sparkle. And let me show you the back. So I said I was going to add a tunnel to the quilt, but while I was working on it, I remembered there's actually a much easier way to add a much easier way to hang your small quilts, and that's by adding these triangles to the corners. They're just squares folded together to shape a triangle, and then you just stitch them in with the binding, and you can just add your stick or whatever you want to use to hang it, and then you can just hang it like that, and it's a lot quicker and easier than having to make a tunnel. So if you're looking for a quick, easy way, do it that way, but don't use it on your big quilts because they will sag. So it's just for small quilts. So that's my Christmas tree quilt finished.